Hello everyone. So our next two classes we are going to focus on the First World War, and in our next class we'll talk more specifically about the First World War itself and the actual combat. But in this class I want to focus on the road to war. That is the build up to the First World War. How did the war break out? I mean, most of you are probably aware that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in June 1914 led to the First World War. But why did an Austrian guy getting shot in Sarajevo in 1914 caused every single power in Europe to go to war with one another? And that's what we're going to explore in this class, understanding the kind of build up to the war in the 30 and 40 years before it broke out. Because really, as I hope you get a sense from this talk, the causes of the First World War were pretty long-rooted. There also has been a lot of debate amongst historians about who was to blame for the war, which power, if any power, was responsible for the war. We won't be necessarily trying to answer that question directly, but certainly we will be looking at some of the long-term causes to get an understanding of why the conflict took place. So, you could probably trace the outbreak of the First World War back to the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. If you remember, France and Prussia went to war in 1870. Prussia comprehensively defeated France and formed a new German empire in the aftermath of that war. At the time, Germany, the new German Chancellor, the old Prussian Chancellor, the new German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, believed that Germany had achieved all of its objectives. It was now the strongest dominant power in Europe. And in Bismarck's opinion, the worst thing Germany could do was fight another war. The basic idea being that Germany was now number one. It had nothing to gain from any future European wars. And Bismarck, in his outlook, was essentially a realist. He believed that Germany was as strong as it could be. He wasn't necessarily an expansionist compared to, say, someone like Adolf Hitler. So he felt Germany was in as strong as a position as it could be. Now it needed peacetime to consolidate its gains, and in order to kind of build upon the work of the creation of the German nation. Bismarck was also aware that the nation most likely to go to war with Germany was France. France essentially wanted a rematch, if it would, with Germany, but Bismarck understood that France would not fight Germany by itself. Essentially, France was a smaller country, the French military was smaller than the German military, and Bismarck understood that France would not go to war unless it had an ally. So for the next 20 years, Bismarck essentially sets about trying to keep France in diplomatic isolation, trying to ensure that it has no allies and that Germany has several allies, which would make a war between Germany and France unlikely. So in 1873, Bismarck encourages the two other major empires of continental Europe, Austria and Russia, to sign a friendship treaty between the three of them, what is known as the Dreikaiserbund. Dreikaiserbund simply means the Three Emperors League. Essentially, it wasn't any kind of deep military commitment to one another. It was more just a pledge to maintain the status quo and not to try and, rock the boat diplomatically. But Bismarck considered it to be a success in that Russia and Austria were both turning an alliance towards Germany, which meant they were not receptive to any kind of alliance with France. It's also worth bearing in mind, of course, that France in 1873 is a republic, a democratic republic. Austria and Russia are autocratic empires, and therefore, in terms of political ideology, are not particularly interested in allying with France either. However, things become more complicated in the later 1870s. In 1877, Russia goes to war with the Ottoman Empire. So you see the Ottoman Empire here in the south of the image. The war goes very well for the Russians. In fact, the Russians are marching on Constantinople, determined to conquer Constantinople for itself. When the other European powers, particularly the British, insist that the Russians make peace and not seize Constantinople, both the Austrians and the British in particular are deeply concerned by the expanse of Russia. The British are concerned that if the Russians capture Constantinople, they will then be able to interfere with the Suez Canal, get control of the Eastern Mediterranean, and be a hindrance for the British Empire and its naval power in particular. The Austrians are more concerned about the expanse of the Russians into the Balkan Peninsula, into southeastern Europe, which Austria believes is its kind of sphere of influence, and it doesn't want the Russians interfering there. So the Russians had actually made a peace deal with the Ottoman Empire, but Bismarck called for a Congress of Berlin in which all the major powers of Europe would gather together and discuss the implications of the Russian war with the Ottoman Empire. And the result of this was that the Congress of Berlin basically changed the peace deal that the Russians had made with the Ottoman Empire. They took some gains away that the Russians had made. And they also granted, I think this is the province of Bosnia and Herzegovina to Austria. Even though Bosnia and Herzegovina was to remain within the Ottoman Empire, it was given to Austria to kind of administrate and rule over. Which sounds like kind of a fudge, which is what it basically was. But the idea being that Austria got a little something from this. Most of the other European powers were pretty satisfied. The one power, of course, that was not satisfied was Russia. And it felt it was kind of strong-armed by the other European nations into making this deal. In particular, it felt that Bismarck had favoured the Austrians over the Russians and had felt betrayed by this. So they felt humiliated in some ways by the Congress of Berlin and begin to start turning away from Germany. Although, as we'll see, Bismarck continues to make efforts to keep Russia within the German sphere of influence. However, the crisis over the Balkan, and it's worth just, let me just go back 1 second actually. Why was the Balkans Peninsula so contentious between the Russians and the Austrians? You can see for geographic reasons, it was to the south of the Austrian Empire. The Austrians essentially wanted to rule it for themselves. But many of the people in the Balkan Peninsulas were Slavic, like Russians, and they kind of looked to Russia as their kind of ethnic bigger brother, who should protect them from Germanic Austria. And I'm using the racial language they would have used in the late 19th century, where the Slavs felt more comfortable with Russian domination of the Balkan Peninsula than Austrian domination of it. So the Balkans Peninsula itself remains a kind of an ethnic and racial kind of tinderbox that eventually will explode in 1914. So the crisis over the Russo-Turkish War essentially forced Germany into a realization that I was going to have to pick one or the other, that Austrian and Russian interests ultimately clashed with one another, that it wasn't natural for Austria and Russia to remain allies in the long term because they were both contesting the Balkan Peninsula, that Germany would have to pick one as its ally, and the decision was to kind of side with Austria. So in 1879, the Germans and Austrians signed a secret treaty. I say secret, people were aware there was some form of alliance, but the terms of it were not published. That was known as the Dual Alliance, which essentially lasts until 1918. So Germany essentially is committing itself to Austria over Russia. What was the nature of the deal? Basically, both sides agreed to help one another if it was attacked by Russia, and to remain neutral if attacked by another power. So in this case, if France attacked Germany, say, Austria would technically remain neutral. But the terms of this was more of a military alliance than the old Dreikaiserbund had been, which had simply been a treaty of friendship. This was now a firm military commitment that if Russia tried to attack either Germany or Austria, the other side would ally and help it face off this attack. And that actually was going to be significant in the run-up to the First World War. However, Bismarck had not totally given up on keeping Russia within the kind of the German diplomatic fold. In 1881, the Dreikaiserbund, which had lapsed, was renewed. And essentially the idea of all that was a promise of friendly neutrality if some other country attacked one of the members. So from the German point of view, while it was not a firm military alliance with the Russians, basically by the terms of the Dreikaiserbund, if France attacked Germany, Russia would not help France. And so for Bismarck, that was good enough because it ensured that France remained diplomatically isolated. The Dual Alliance, however, gained a new partner in 1882, which was Italy. Italy had imperial ambitions, was trying to expand into North Africa, but as was France. France seized Tunisia, which the Italians had been hoping to capture for themselves. Tunisia is next to Algeria, which was already a French colony. So the French seized Tunisia in 1882. The Italians were outraged. They realized they needed to find new diplomatic allies, and they decided to join the Triple Alliance in 1882. And that's what this picture is showing here. The Triple Alliance, the idea being Germany and Austria, and then the little short guy who can't reach up his glass high enough is supposed to be Italy, reflecting the fact that Italy is not a major military power in the European theatre. However, for Bismarck, this all seemed to be going well. So by the mid-1880s, Austria was in a firm alliance with Germany, as was Italy. Russia, again, in a relatively neutral alliance, but Bismarck considered that to be a positive. And France essentially was diplomatically isolated. The one other major European power was Britain, but Britain's policy at the time was what was known as splendid isolation, where the British did not want to get involved in European politics at all. So France really had no allies on the continent. And from a German point of view, this is perfect. France was isolated. It would not go to war with Germany, which meant that German dominance of Europe seemed to continue for the foreseeable future.